Hi. Okay, so since I watched podcasts and vodcasts, I thought the best way to describe and summarize what they were would be to make a podcast or vodcast of my own. So I'm going to do a vodcast because you're seeing live video of me. The first podcast that I listened to was the second one on the website, and she played a clip from an interview with Karen Minden at the California AFERD conference, and then she also talked about some mobile devices and different things. The first thing she did was give a brief history over just mobile devices and different things used for physical education. She talked about Scantron forms, personal PDAs. She talked about the Apple Newton, which is way before my time, but it was kind of interesting to hear about. A significant date she gave was 1995, where she talked about the Palm Pilot, which was kind of coming out of popularity when I got into physical education and my collegiate time, and she talked about how there were thousands of applications for that, and it ran on the Palm OS system. Then she got into 2005 when smartphones came out, and that was kind of the next big jump for technology in education, and she talked about how they run on different systems: Windows Mobile, BlackBerry, Symbian, the iPhone, Android, and WebOS. I have experience with iPhone and Android. Android is my preferred system, which I know is kind of odd. A lot of people like the iPhone and the Apple systems, but I'm a PC girl at heart. She talked about the differences between an ultra-mobile computer and a smartphone, and some of the benefits of the ultra-mobile computer were it's a convertible tablet, it's lightweight, it can connect to Wi-Fi or Bluetooth. Some of the limitations are the size of the hard drive, the memory, and the processing speed, but a lot of them can connect to an external keyboard, can connect to an external monitor or a mouse, and there's no need for you to upload data to another computer. That is the actual device. Some of the things she talked about with smartphones are that they replace the PDA. There's a lot to choose from. Like we talked about the iPhone, which is the most popular, the iPod Touch, some of those have the touch screens. A lot of the Androids and other things have touch screens now, which have the multi-sensory where you can touch with 2 fingers and widen and things like that, which are really cool. You can get internet access. My smartphone has 4G, so I don't need Wi-Fi or anything like that. I can have internet access wherever I'm at. And then a lot of those have print and share options available where you can download applications and send them to your computer to print. Some of the things with those that are downfall are that you have to upload the stuff to your actual personal computer. It's not the same as the ultra-mobile computer. There are lots of applications available for purchase, and they require you, once again, to upload the data, unless you have a remote desktop, which she talked about in a later podcast that I didn't listen to. In her interview with Karen Minden, who was a former NASB toy and a Disney toy Teacher of the Year, she gave a quote that I wrote down, which was that technology can provide more reliability to assessment, which I thought was definitely true. It provides reliability. It gives us something to really solidify with assessment. She also talked about how kids can track their own fitness with it, and how they can do health-related fitness tutorials and portfolios. She's done that with her own 7th and 8th graders, which was really neat. Then at the end of the podcast, they took listeners' questions. One was about grants, and they talked a lot about the PEP grant, how it's available in early April, due in May. This was a couple years ago, but I think that's still about the same format that they take, and she put a link to their website there. Some people asked what types of tech they should be using in their education, and she gave a really interesting site, which was ISTE.org, and it has the standards for technology in education, which I'd never heard for, but I thought that's really cool. She likened it to NASB for technology. She put a link on their page, and they have standards for teachers, for administrators, and for students, and they're called NETS, National Education Technology Standards, and that's definitely something that I'm going to be looking into when I want to get technology not only, but also when I want to advocate for getting funding for technology. And then another question they asked was, how do you make a podcast? And obviously I listened, and I am doing my own, but she said you can use GarageBand on a Mac computer, you can use Audacity. I myself am just using my webcam on my computer, but there's lots of different things that you can do. You can convert it to an audio format, you can do an MP3, or you can do a video like I'm doing. And so that was the podcast that I listened to, and it was number 2, again, on the website. Some ways I could use information from this particular podcast were with the tablets versus smartphones, just talking about some of the benefits of each of them, the fitness tracking that Karen had talked about I could use that in some things. The health-related fitness tutorials would be really neat. And then the ISTE standards, I think, were the most valuable thing that I got out of this podcast. Just knowing that there are standards for what technology to use in education, and physical education specifically, will help me determine what is best for assessment. Okay, the next podcast I watched was number 5 on the website, and one of the things it talked about was the new addition to her podcast, because she was still just doing pod. She hadn't added video, but she added screencasts, screenshots, or even screen dumps, I think she called them at one point, which is essentially just taking a picture of the screen and being able to show it along with your podcast or with your audio. And she talked about how to do that and how they added it to the last month. A couple other things she talked about were Facebook and how it was updating its privacy features. This was quite a while back. I think this podcast happened to be maybe in 2010. And I remember when all that was going on and people were just a little bit concerned about the privacy on Facebook. So that was one thing she discussed. She also talked about the American Heart Association teaming up with Nintendo for the Wii consoles, which I remember this coming out too. And American Heart Association was kind of putting their stamp of approval on the Nintendo games, and then Nintendo donated a large amount of money to the American Heart Association for working with them and kind of teaming together, which is always cool to see. Things that are popular, teaming with people that are interested in the health and well-being of Americans. Some of the new devices she talked about coming out then were an Expo PC Slate, which I think was one of the first things to compete with the iPad, and it was, a little bit cheaper and just some neat things going on with it, and now there's all kinds of things coming out with that recently. She also talked about how there was a company with a program called One Laptop for Every Child, and they were trying to come up with a $100 tablet for students, and she talked about some of the capabilities that it had, 3D high-def video, it had the Android operating system, Wi-Fi, video, a multi-touch screen. I'd be interested to see if any of that ever came to fruition, because that would be really neat for students to have. She also talked about the first look at the Xbox Kinect, which has been out for a while now, and it kind of lived up to all the hype, and she talked about how she didn't know whether it would or not. But it's got the video sensor, it attaches to the Xbox, it has depth perception and voice recognition and some of those things that the Wii just couldn't do, and it's pretty neat. And I think that'll be an interesting thing that we'll start to see used in a lot of physical education classes here in the near future. She talked about instructional software for students. There was a Problem Solving Complete, which it kind of sounded like was something that her company that she works with had put together, and she went through a lot of the different things, and you could create instructional software, an electronic portfolio, and an electronic quiz, and she went through all the different segments. There was a lot of things on there, but there were some really neat things. I thought it was cool that there was sign language and Spanish all throughout the program, so students with maybe English language learners or students with hearing difficulty and things like that could still use it, which was cool. She also talked about how to add graphic images to podcasts and different things like that using Adobe Photoshop, iPhoto, Paint, Picasa, which are some free things. She talked about PowerPoint and how to do some basic things in that, which PowerPoint's been around for a while, so I was pretty comfortable with a lot of that, but it was neat to hear. Then she talked about heart rate monitors and how that it's important when you're buying them to find ones where you can replace the battery and the transmitter. She talked about CardioSport being kind of her favorite because of the customer service and that it interfaces with Windows computers. And then Bowflex didn't have a transmitter, but that was the best one that she found to be accurate without the transmitter. And she said she liked the version with the 2-finger or 3 contact points the best. She also talked about iMovie, using that for vodcasts, which, as you can see, I'm doing a vodcast. I'm not using iMovie because I don't have a Mac, and I don't want a Mac, so I'm using Windows Movie Maker. She kind of gave a little overview of the previous month's cast and how she did some of the things. And one thing that she talked about that I didn't know before was the Ken Burns effect, is where you take a screen and make it a little bit smaller and then a little bit bigger, or focus on different points to make it look like there's motion in a still frame, which was pretty cool. Then she talked about a listener's question, which was being able to print from an iPad. And she talked about how you could go to the App Store and find some different print and share apps, or you could take a screenshot like we talked about, and upload your pictures to your computer and then print there. The problem with that is that you're printing it as a picture rather than maybe a document format and some of those things that you might have. So that's what she talked about in this 5th podcast on her website. Some of the things I could use for assessment from this first podcast were tablets. I really think that would be a viable way for me to record data for assessments with my students. The Nintendo and the Xbox Kinect, I think with the Wii and the Kinect, that's a really cool way that you can have students perform different movements and have the actual video games say whether they were performing them correctly or semi-correctly. I mean, there's a little bit of room for error, but it's kind of a neat and fun way for them to do it. Also, having the student tablets would be a great way for them to do some alternative assessments and some projects and things themselves. Also, the heart rate monitors is a way to assess some of the fitness components. Okay, and the last podcast, I'm not really sure which one this classifies as, that I watched was number 13. One thing that really bothered me in this is that she kept saying APERD. I don't know, maybe it's just a Kansas thing, but everybody I know calls it AFERD. So anyway, little pet peeve, got that out of the way. And she talked about her recent sessions that she did at the California APERD convention, and she gave one on online physical education, and she just talked about kind of the progression of that over the years, how people have started to actually accept that as a viable way to teach physical education. And then she also talked about some standards-based lesson planning that she presented about, and how she wasn't a big fan of some of the celebrity guests at the convention, which I can remember a Central District AFERD convention where they had a celebrity guest who kind of bothered me and rubbed me the wrong way for some of the same reasons, just didn't really have the pedagogy down and some of the terminology and things they were using. So it seems to be a common problem kind of across the country. She talked about the fitness report, which was introduced in the late 80s. I'd never heard of the fitness report. I think this was a California thing, but it seemed very similar to some of the other kind of fitness things that we have around the nation. She talked about the different stats and the printable reports and things, just a basic overview. Talked about how it aligned with the state fitness report for California and Virginia, and some other things that she had for Missouri, Connecticut, and the President's Fitness Challenge. She showed how you can do some things on Movie Maker, which is what I'm using right now, so I didn't really learn too much new stuff, but it kind of just solidified what I already knew about Movie Maker. Talked about just a basic tutorial, how to do transitions, add visual effects, and etc., how to upload video footage, add it to the movie, how to save it frequently, and kind of watch it back to make sure everything looks okay, how to add still images, transitions, text, random edits, and what kind of font and different things to use for it, and the difference between a caption versus a title. She also talked about how to add music and narrations and things, and how to use Sound Recorder, which is a really basic system that your computer has for free. And then she said to always save as a WMV file when you're uploading. The last thing she talked about on this podcast was an echo pedometer, and she talked about how there's 3 different versions, 1, 2, and 3, and she really liked the first version because it's steps only, and she said that the distance and the caloric input and some of those other things just really can't be very accurate. And so they're very comfortable offering the number 1 on their website, but not any of the other ones. And that was kind of a short, brief podcast, but it just went over some of the basics for all those things. I liked this podcast. I didn't get a ton of information that could be used specifically for assessment out of it, but she did talk a lot about the fitness report for California and some other states. And then she also talked about echo pedometers and just kind of what to look for in a pedometer, which, as we all know, can be used for assessment purposes for fitness things.